My name's John Howe. I built this Kennington Cross tram layout. It shows London trams in the last few years, around about 1950, just a couple of years before it all closed. I've built various tram layouts over the years. What I wanted to do with this one was to show just a typical scene. The thing about any tram layout is that it needs to show the busyness of the system. Trams are literally buses on rails, and that's what I wanted to show. The trams coming and going. There's a simple junction, and it's really an attempt to show the busyness of life in London with the trams in 1950. An important part of the layout are the buildings. All of the buildings are copies or representations of buildings which appear somewhere in London. I've modified one or two. The buildings are from my Kingsway Models range of card kits. Rather crude, you've got to cut the bits out yourself, but the important thing is, for me, is that they are based on real buildings and generally from the London area. A lot of people would say that London trams all look the same, and there's a certain amount of truth in that. One particular model built by the LCC, the E1, really formed the majority of the fleet, and if it wasn't an E1, very often it was something that looked very, very much the same. There are a couple of Felthams as well. These are probably the most famous London trams. They were modern, 1930s, they had modern technology for the time anyway, air brakes and that sort of thing. I've also been lucky enough to get a model of Bluebird, which was the LCC's last attempt to show what they could do for a future fleet. The real thing is preserved at the National Tramway Museum at Christchurch. Unfortunately, only one was ever built, and then within 2 or 3 years, London Transport was formed, which took over all of the transport in London, underground buses and trams. And the top brass in London Transport were always accused of being very much anti-tram, and so the trams were ready to be replaced by trolley buses. This programme started and would have continued and probably have been done by about 1945, but other events took place, and finally the trams were done away with in the early 50s, the last ones running in July 1952. A large proportion of the London tram network ran on the conduit system. Dating back to the days of the LCC, the city fathers didn't like the idea of obstructive overhead wires getting in front of all the buildings, and so this very complicated design was used, where a conduit underneath the tram picked up the power from a slot in the middle of the road. It was very expensive and difficult to build, but of course for a modeller it makes things very, very easy. I can run the trams on normal track. I've very much enjoyed building this layout. It's my latest one, and I think it's probably the best one. I'll be taking it to a few shows not too far from where I live.